Hi there.
Hello. Oh. Hi Elaine, we've just started, so we're live now. So welcome everyone to this event. I'll just wait 30 seconds to give everyone a chance to get into the session, and then we'll get started. Right, so welcome. Thank you everyone for coming today. I think there are still some people joining the session, but I'll get started just with the introductions. This event is a webinar entitled What Social Workers Need to Know About Coercive Control. It's just to let you know that the event is going to be recorded. So whilst the chat facility is available, just be careful that you only post things into the chat that you're happy for everyone to see. And the event will be uploaded eventually onto our YouTube channel. So you will be able to access it afterwards. If anyone has any questions to ask any of the panelists, there will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentations. But if you could put your questions and answers into the question and answer box, not the chat box. Sometimes the chat gets too busy and it's difficult to pull out the questions. So if you can use the Q&A box, that's excellent. We aren't some people have talked about not being able to see yourselves. The camera facility and the sound facility for participants isn't activated because this is a webinar format. So you can engage with them, ask questions, but through the Q&A facility. Yeah, just remember it's a public platform. To be careful what you put on. So we'll get started. So this webinar, as I say, is called What Social Workers Need to Know About Coercive Control. So coercive control is a central feature of domestic violence. It's become very much a part of the public debate around domestic violence in recent years. And so for social workers and others working in social care settings, understanding coercive control and how it operates within the context of domestic violence is a key piece of knowledge in working with adults, children, victims and perpetrators of domestic violence. So this webinar sits quite comfortably in a short series of webinars that we've been hosting on domestic violence. 2 weeks ago, we discussed working with perpetrators of domestic abuse. And if you missed that, you can always catch up on all of our public webinars on the YouTube channel. And there's a link at the top of the chat to that. On the 12th of May, we have our third webinar, which is entitled Mothers, Domestic Abuse and Social Work Interventions. At that webinar, we'll be discussing and indeed critiquing social work interventions with mothers who are victims of domestic abuse, exploring the challenges which social workers face in terms of domestic violence, the concept of responsibilisation of mothers for the abuse which they suffer. And at the webinar, we'll have Dr. Elaine Arnold, who's the Director of the Institute of Community and Society here at the University of Wolverhampton, Nikki Plummer, who is the Domestic Abuse Lead Manager at Birmingham Children's Trust, and Sharon Fennick, Family Service Manager at Leicester-based charity Living Without Abuse. So again, there is a link in the chat to that where you can sign up to that event. And then finally, we've got a domestic violence, the final domestic violence webinar is on the 26th of May, where there'll be a webinar around how service providers have adapted during COVID-19. And this is grounded partly in some research we've been undertaking at the University of Wolverhampton, and those tickets will become available very soon. So moving on to today's session, I will let the speakers introduce themselves in more detail, but briefly firstly we have Dr. Emma Katz, who is a senior lecturer in childhood and youth at Liverpool Hope University. Her research explores coercive control-based domestic abuse and its impact on child and adult victims and survivors. Emma's research has won Women Against Violence Europe's Coercive Prize and the Wiley Prize for Best Paper in Child Abuse Review. Her groundbreaking new book, Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers' Lives, will be published soon by Oxford University Press. And you can follow Emma on Twitter at Dr. Emma Katz. And again, there is a link in the chat to her web page, to her Twitter page. Next, after that, we have Keisha Harper, who is a domestic abuse specialist at the City of Wolverhampton Council. Keisha currently works as a domestic abuse specialist for the City of Wolverhampton Council. She has experience working in the women's sector, both in the UK and overseas, and she's most recently worked as a researcher in the field of male violence against women and girls. And finally, we have Deb, who's a young person's independent domestic violence advocate advisor, supporting children and young people 0 to 19 who are deemed to be at high risk of further serious assault, stalking or homicide from domestic violence. She works with Living Without Abuse in the City of Leicester. Deb has over 30 years experience working in the field of domestic violence and abuse in refuge, community-based support, crisis response services, and with high-risk victims. And just for your information, Emma has to leave early, so she will drop out of the session around around 1:40, but Dr. Elaine Arnold will pick up answering questions in terms of academic sort of responses to questions that are asked around the sort of academic research literature. So I'll hand over then straight away to Dr. Emma Katz. Thank you very much for presenting here today, Emma.
Well, thank you for inviting me. So hopefully you can all see my screen share. Do let us know if you can't. And today I'm going to be talking about, firstly, what coercive control is and how it works, and then its impacts on any children and young people who are living with it. So, firstly, understanding coercive control. Coercive control is a really severe form of domestic abuse. It's the deep end of domestic abuse. And within it, victims' lives and their freedoms are seriously limited. Coercive control involves situations where somebody subjects another person or persons to persistent controlling behaviour and makes it clear that standing up for themselves will be punished. So it's like a constant, you have to do what I say or else sort of situation. And when perpetrators threaten punishment, this may take many forms. It might be violence, but it's not always violence. But it will be something that they know that the victim dreads, like cruel verbal put-downs, or hurting children or pets. By repeatedly punishing the victim for non-compliance, the perpetrator hopes to demoralize and terrorize the victim into a state of permanent submission. And that's what the perpetrator is aiming for. This is a phenomenon mainly perpetrated by men. Research by Michael Johnson and colleagues in the US found that 22% of women had experienced coercive control from ex-husbands, and 5.4% of men had experienced coercive control from ex-wives. Research by Andy Myhill in the UK found that out of a group of women and men who'd experienced some kind of domestic abuse, something abusive had happened in their relationship, 30% of those women and 6% of those men had experienced something severe enough to be called coercive control. Something that made them fearful, that made them feel belittled, that was really serious and severe. And here I break down in more detail what coercive control involves. And I've also got my terrible toolbox, which is the perpetrator's toolbox of coercive control. And if you imagine that each item on this list is a tool that the perpetrator is using in their effort to get control of their victim or victims. So the emotional and psychological abuse and manipulation is the hammer. The control of the time and the movement and the micromanaging of daily life is the screwdriver. Sexual coerciveness and rape, paranoia about infidelity, intimate image or video abuse, and reproductive coercion may be the wrench, and so forth. And you also have economic abuse, which includes interfering with their employment, preventing them from having money, refusing to contribute to bills, or creating debts for which they are liable. isolating them from sources of support, including family, friends, and professionals, constantly monitoring them and stalking them, which may take place during the relationship or after it, manipulating others, including any children in the family, in order to upset and marginalize and disempower the victim and survivor, using legal or institutional means to threaten, harm, or discredit the survivor, such as making false reports about them or taking them to court vexatiously over and over again. And then there may be physical violence, and I consider physical violence to be part of the coercive control, because the perpetrator's doing it with the same mindset as they're doing everything else. It's about terrifying the victim into submission, getting them to do as the perpetrator tells them. So there may be physical violence. There may not be violence, but there may be threats of violence against the survivor, their loved ones, including their pets and their property. And the threat of violence can be as effective as physical violence. For example, I heard of a case where a perpetrator had taken a big kitchen knife and slashed the back of the fabric dining chairs, so all the fabric was hanging off the back of the frame. And although that probably wouldn't register even as a crime, after all, it was the family's own chairs, it's such a threat, isn't it? Because it's such a radical thing to do. It's like they're saying clearly to the victim, I'm willing to do this to the chairs. Think what I will do to you if you don't cooperate. Evan Stark's book, Coercive Control: How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life, argued that our responses to domestic abuse that's got this coercive control dynamic was really failing female victims. Our responses were failing female victims because they were wrongly seeing domestic abuse as discrete incidents or episodes of violence. And virtually all of our research and all of our intervention is based on this model. And this overlooks that coercive control perpetrators are using many other abusive tactics besides physical violence. They're using emotional abuse, monitoring, and micro-regulation. They're using isolation and economic abuse, and they are using these tactics continuously. So victims and survivors are therefore being repeatedly or constantly abused, even if there has not been an incident of physical violence for months or ever. And this really helps to explain a lot of the behavior that we see in victims and survivors, because they're not being subjected to occasional one-off incidents, they're being subjected to constant abuse. Some perpetrators use no violence at all. As Stark and Hester discuss, fear, constraint on autonomy, belittlement, and other aspects of abuse can create entrapment without any incident of violence. And Nivala's EU-wide data from the European Union's Violence Against Women survey looked at women who reported in the survey that they were experiencing high levels of control from their current partner. And of those women who said, yes, I'm experiencing high levels of control from my current partner, 45% said they were not experiencing any violence alongside this high level of control, and 55% said they were experiencing violence and high levels of control. So it's almost a half and half split there. And Day and Bowen suggest that these non-violent perpetrators are actually the most clever and skillful abusers, because they have mastered more covert and hard to identify ways of abusing. So a bit of a spotlight here on perpetrators. We hear so often, don't we, that they are absolutely charming and dreamy at the beginning of the relationship to suck the victim in and gain their commitment quickly. And they can also use nice, romantic, or contrite, I'm sorry, behaviors from time to time to keep the victim locked in by giving them false hope. But the fact that things are good in the relationship at the moment doesn't mean the abuse is over. That is all part of the abuse. It's the giving of false hope. Abusers are very clever at excusing, justifying, and denying their behavior. They can present to others as kind, caring, as a normal person, but this is really deceptive. They may be highly qualified and in a respected job. And indeed, some perpetrators seem to gravitate towards jobs where they have a lot of power, such as like quite a high up job in the police, or a job in the army, or a job as a boss in an office, where they really have power and control over people. Often they're good at recruiting allies from among their family, friendship groups, workplaces, and communities. And they're often good at turning professionals involved with the family into their allies as well. They often make counter accusations such as, she's crazy, she's mentally unbalanced, or she's alienating the kids from me, in order to explain why the kids are scared of them and don't want to be with them. They'll make the counter accusation that it's her fault, she's caused that, it's not my behavior, it's her. And in general, perpetrators will use whatever tactics will work best, in their opinion, to gain control and keep control, whether that means being nice or being horrible. And coercive control is very much caused by the perpetrator. So perpetrators tend to be extremely self-centered and often have a highly inflated sense of entitlement. They believe their needs come first and that their partner and children should make pleasing them the priority. So coercive control is not being caused by a turbulent relationship or a toxic relationship or a bad dynamic between the partners. What it is being caused by is the perpetrator's deeply held belief systems, attitudes, and expectations. It's being caused by what the perpetrator thinks is acceptable behavior. And these attitudes and belief systems and expectations are things that the perpetrator would have held before this relationship began. And the perpetrator's tendency to coercively control won't disappear when that relationship ends either. It remains within the perpetrator. So put simply, the problem is in the perpetrator. It's not in the relationship. And for adult victims, there's a lot of myths around what they might be like or how they might behave. So for example, if a victim and survivor fights back, or has less than perfect behavior herself, or is intelligent and seems confident and is from an affluent background, then often we think, well, she can't be a real victim. She's problematic herself, or she's too confident, or something like that. But the reality is that the victims come from all walks of life and are affected in different ways. Some victims fight back and some don't, depending on the context. Some maintain their employment and seem confident and successful, are in really, well-respected, highly paid jobs. And some turn to alcohol or medication or drugs to try and cope with the perpetrator's abuse, to try and cope with the hellish conditions at home. And many become mentally unwell because of the perpetrator's abuse. And they're all real victims. And then I want to take a quick look at the idea of fights and arguments, because these are really misleading when it comes to coercive control. When there's coercive control, anything that looks like a fight or an argument is actually about the perpetrator trying to impose the control on the victim and the victim resisting this. And that resistance is, of course, a reasonable and psychologically healthy thing for the victim to be doing. Resistance may take the form of shouting or screaming or using violence defensively or to fight back, but this doesn't mean they aren't a real victim. If they're experiencing coercive control, they are a real victim. The perpetrator may seem angry, but this isn't because they have a problem with anger. They don't. It's because they are enraged that the victim is resisting their control. Their expectation that they should be in control of this other person is the root cause of their anger. So they have a problem with control, not with anger. And their abuse is being done with a purpose, and that purpose is control. Perpetrators often use their abusive behaviors, be that shouting or put downs or threats or violence, to punish the victim for resisting their control. And they use their abuse to manipulate, belittle, and frighten their victim into greater submission in the future. And then I just want to flag this up. One of the first things perpetrators will do when they start to get challenged on their behavior is claim that they are willing to change. So we need to be on the lookout for this. And Bancroft provides an excellent checklist for assessing whether this change is real or is just part of the perpetrator's manipulation. So if you click on this link, then you'll be able to get to Appendix D of this Research in Practice report, which has Bancroft's checklist on assessing change in perpetrators. And I'd really recommend that, it's great. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you more about the impacts on children and young people. There's a wealth of research from multiple different countries that male coercive control and domestic abuse perpetrators are usually harmful fathers. There's less research on the parenting of perpetrating mothers, because perpetrating mothers are much rarer, as we saw earlier. So I'm going to be talking here about perpetrating fathers because we have a wealth of research evidence on that. Early work on the parenting of domestically violent men described them as hostile, coercive, demanding and entitled fathers who are likely to have rigid and unreasonable rules for their children, little patience, high expectations, and use harsh forms of discipline. And subsequent research has borne out these descriptions. Perpetrators have elevated risks of physically, psychologically, and sexually abusing and neglecting children in their care. And they may also stalk, threaten, and terrorize their children as part of their abuse against ex-partners. And I myself have interviewed with 15 mums and 15 of their children about experiences of coercive control. Most of the children I interviewed were aged between 10 and 14, with the exception of one 20-year-old who still lived with his mum. And I interviewed with 9 girls and 6 boys. The perpetrators had been the children's biological father or stepfather. And at the time I interviewed them, they'd all separated from the perpetrator and were living in the community. And I'm going to share with you what they said. So firstly, I found that the perpetrators were demanding high levels of attention from the mothers at the expense of the children. My daughter Leah used to want me to sit and brush her hair, but that wasn't allowed because he'd be jealous. He'd say things like, "You spent enough attention on her, what about my attention?" When Mum was giving me attention, he'd tell her to go over to him, so she'd have to leave me to play by myself. So here we can see that the coercive control from the father was limiting the amount of maternal attention that children could enjoy and reducing the opportunities for fun and affection in their homes. And children described feeling sad and annoyed and angry at these situations. Many children had very limited freedom to say and do normal age-appropriate things at home. The children had to constrain their own natural behaviour to comply with the father's demands. When he came home from work, he'd want to spend time with them, and they were always his girls. Very possessive, that's quite typical in perpetrators. He used to say to Zoe, his daughter, "You're my little angel." But at the same time, they couldn't shout, they couldn't make noise, they couldn't be children around him unless it was on his terms. It was all right if he wanted to play with them, but at other times, it was like he wanted them to disappear. And this mum described how the children had been left really anxious by this because they could never tell whether he was wanting them to switch on and be little angels and play with him, or whether he was wanting them to disappear, make no noise, blend into the wallpaper. And when perpetrators controlled mothers' movements outside the home, this also severely restricted children's social lives, especially if the kids were, like younger, like under 10 or 12. It prevented children from engaging with wider family, peers, and doing extracurricular activities. The kids couldn't have any friends round because he'd kick off or something. And kids' parties were another problem because he'd be accusing me of trying to get off with one of the dads, have sexual relations with one of the dads. So parties were out of the question. And we couldn't do any after-school clubs because he insisted I had to be back by a certain time. So she wasn't able to pick them up from the after-school club, which finished after the curfew. Me and the kids weren't allowed to go around to see their grandparents. So here we can see that the multiple benefits that positive experiences with grandparents, friends, or in after-school clubs could have on children's social skills, confidence, and development were being denied to these children by their fathers or stepfathers. And because of the father's behaviours, many of the children were living in the very same isolated and lonely worlds as their mothers, especially younger children who were more reliant on mums to be able to facilitate access to friends' houses, playgrounds, days out. And if mums couldn't take them there, they couldn't go. Some perpetrators used extreme tactics for depriving the family of freedom, independence, and resources, and they did this to their children as well as the mothers. So this is a mother and son who were interviewed together because they wanted to be. He'd tell us that we couldn't touch the food in the fridge, that we weren't allowed to eat. He'd lock us in the house a lot of the time so we couldn't get out. He'd unplug the phone. He'd take out the power because in the hall we've got an old electric box where you can take things out and that's it. You've got no power. He used to take an element out of the central heating so we'd have no heating. He'd lock us in the house and go out. He'd take the modem so John couldn't do his homework and I couldn't do my banking on the computer. So we were prisoners in a way. And so these tactics highlight how some perpetrators and fathers directly and purposefully extended their coercively controlling abuse over their children, as well as over their girlfriend or wife. And if we think here about the mums, it's really important to remember that the perpetrators were keeping the mums in what Williamson calls unrealities, these sort of bubbles of unreality, just shaped by manipulation and excuses designed to keep them confused and compliant. And plus, the mums were also living in societies that tend to give the messages that children do best when they have two parents in their life and that divorce is bad for children. So in these circumstances, mums living with this kind of coercive control can't be expected to easily recognise the impacts it's having on the children, and they often require multi-layered and sensitive supports to enable them to recognise this fully. Most mums tend to do what they can to keep their children as safe and okay as possible in these sorts of circumstances, though their ability to do this can be really limited by the perpetrator, the father's determination to abuse in ways that harm the children, and also by the negative impacts that his abuse is having on her. So they're doing their best, but there's limits to what they can do because of the perpetrator. Positive parenting, however, for mums is a major factor in helping children to cope with the domestic abuse. And we know that the more positive the mum's parenting is in these circumstances, the more she's able to maintain that, the better the children tend to cope. And we know from children themselves that mums are cited more frequently by children who've lived with domestic abuse as their most important source of help than anyone else in their lives. The relationship with their mother is most children's major support in coping. And as Melinda put it, women may need positive reinforcement in this role, which at present they rarely receive. So I'm going to just take a quick look at what happens post-separation before I conclude. Coercive control perpetrators don't tend to respect their partner's decision to end the relationship. They typically continue in their efforts to control and dominate their partner's life, and or punish them for trying to break free. And there's much research on this from multiple countries. This means that most perpetrators of coercive control continue to harm their children post-separation. So separation doesn't equal safety for the mother or children. And I teamed up with researchers at the University of Lapland in Finland. We compared my data on children and coercive control with data they'd gathered in Finland through their interviews with Finnish children. And in total, we drew one interview data with 29 children, and we looked at how these children had experienced post-separation coercive control. And this is what we found. So some children described this really dangerous behavior from their fathers post-separation. He used to ring some other men and try and break into the house, and me and my brothers feared for our lives because he used to smack on the doors and I used to hide. My dad's injunction ran out. He kept turning up at the house. Then he wrote something on the back door. He wrote "dead bitch." And my mum tried to get it removed before we could see it, but I saw it before it got removed. He went to the mother's workplace to threaten her. And then it started that everyone who helped us, they also got death threats. And in the end, in the refuge, the workers started to get those threats. And he went there, raging outside the refuge. So perpetrators' dangerous fathering post-separation could make children's and mums' lives frightening and unpredictable. It was drastically limiting the safe space available to them, often leaving them under siege in their own homes or even in a refuge. The perpetrator's dangerous fathering was certainly undermining the children's emotional and physical security and well-being. We also found that some perpetrators used something that we called admirable fathering as part of their ongoing attempts to control ex-partners. And this involved presenting themselves as admirable fathers to school staff, to other parents, to wider communities, both online and offline, and to professionals. And the persona of the admirable father could include playing the roles of being a caring and committed father or a vulnerable victim father, but in one way or another, a father deserving of praise and support. And this appeared to be part of perpetrator strategies to increase their own power while further marginalizing and weakening their ex-partner, who was then seen as bad in comparison. Some perpetrators directed performances of admirable fathering at their children, for example, by claiming to be vulnerable victims to the children themselves. As this one child in the UK described, during our weekend visits to him, he'd say, "Oh, your mum makes me cry. Your mum makes me do this stuff. I can't see you because of your mum." And he just paints such a bad picture of her, and he blamed her and us for everything. He said he was on antidepressants because I wasn't seeing him often enough. I felt very small and bad. After our weekend visits with our father, my sister Zoe would be off school most Mondays because she felt so ill. She was on the sofa being held by mum and crying. And he would call my sister Zoe and say, "You're the only one who really loves me." And I was just so drained and I felt like crying all the time. So here, this father was producing guilt trips in his daughters, refusing to take responsibility for his own emotional state. By presenting himself as a vulnerable victim, he was coercing his daughters into maintaining relationships with him that were harmful to their well-being. By making his children feel as though they were responsible for his welfare, he was disguising the emotional power he was actually wielding over them. And I should say that in this case, that this contact was court ordered, so there was very little the mother could do to protect her children from it because the court had ordered it. Many children experience their father as this constant negative presence in their post-separation lives, whether they saw him frequently or not. This was leaving the children in a continual state of anxiety and worry and harming their ability to live a normal life. I have to check it so that the doors are locked and that the windows are closed. Now sometimes I'll sleep in my mum's bed because I feel more comfortable there and I feel more safe sleeping there. It was sometimes even that we weren't able to go to school. I didn't want to leave my mum alone for the day. And children described terror that they might encounter their father in the community, and that they described things like panic attacks, bedwetting, and nightmares. So to conclude, coercive control is a really severe form of abuse, and perpetrators of coercive control cause high levels of harm. Coercive control perpetrating fathers tend to parent their children in negative ways and subject their children to coercive control in ways that profoundly harm the children's day-to-day experiences of life. The adult victim separating from the perpetrator is unlikely to be enough to make the children safe, as perpetrators usually continue their control post-separation. The problem lies in the perpetrator, who is usually, though not always, but usually the children's father or father figure. So tackling the problem means tackling the perpetrator, holding them accountable, curbing their ability to continue abusing, and helping the adult and child victims to be safe. And by that, I mean really safe, not safe on paper. And one of my interviewees described how her and her daughter were made safe on paper by moving them into a B&B. And in this B&B, they were just existing on a mattress on the floor. And they had drug addicts banging on the door and trying to get into their room at 4 a.m. And they also described how the perpetrator was let out on bail, and then they were given rape alarms so that if they were walking the street and they saw the perpetrator, they could pull the rape alarm. And the little daughter, who was 6 or 7, had a rape alarm for her walk to school, so if she saw her father, she could pull it. And that is not safe. That might be safe on paper, but it's not safe. They didn't feel safe, and they both became really mentally unwell living in those conditions. So I just want to let you know that my book, Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers' Lives, which goes into these issues and more in more detail, is going to be published in probably early 2022 by Oxford University Press. These are my publications to date. If you would like a copy, feel free to give me an email and I will send you a copy. And I've also got a link to a Survey Monkey that's ever so quick. It'll only take you a couple of minutes. I'm going to pop it in the chat. If you could click on that and provide me with a bit of brief feedback, I would really appreciate it, because I want to make these sessions as good as I can do. And to hear more about my research, follow me on Twitter at Dr. Emma Katz, and the references are here. If anyone wants a copy of these slides, also feel free to drop me an email and I will send you a copy. And I'll just pop that link in the chat. Thank you, everyone. I hope that was useful.
That was excellent. Thank you, Emma. And there was quite a lot of discussion in the chat around getting the slides. So that's really helpful that people can email you direct to get them.
No problem. Yeah.
That's great. So I mean, there was just tons and tons of information in there, which I think links really nicely to the previous webinar we had, and some of the things that people were talking about in terms of fathers and the centrality of coercive control in terms of the perpetrator aspect. I do apologise, you may be able to hear my dog barking. So I think that is really helpful, and I think it'll probably link quite nicely into leads quite nicely into Keisha's talk and presentation, who is up next. So I shall hand you over to Keisha.
Thank you, Susie. So I'm just going to try and share my screen. At the moment, I think, Emma, you might still be sharing.
Oh, sorry, I am.
Okay.
Let me turn that off. I was just putting my link in the chat. There we go.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, can you all see that okay?
Yes, Keisha, thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, so yeah, I agree. I think actually that links in really well with the element that I'm going to talk about, and that's coercive control and domestic homicide. So as Susie mentioned, some of my previous experience has been frontline work and also research into male violence against women. And as part of this research, we looked at femicides and within that, domestic homicides. So there's a lot I could say about this subject, but I'm going to really try and summarise it the best that I can. So to start, domestic homicide is often the final act of brutal violence. However, this doesn't mean that violence was evident in the relationship before. I think this is really important because when we hear about domestic homicide, we know that there's been a murder. We know that often it's a very violent act within that murder. And I think that instantly creates a picture of violence and chaos and indicates that maybe this is how the relationship has always been. But actually, in many cases, there isn't any violence prior to that. And again, that links back to that element of control, which I'll talk about a bit more. So coercive control is sometimes lost when we're looking at homicide, and it's about understanding that wider picture. So linking in with what Dr. Emma Katz mentioned is it's about understanding all those different elements, understanding that the economic abuse is a form of control, understanding that stalking is a form of control. And when we're looking at that fatality of the homicide, there is often this picture before that very much leads up to the homicide and very much indicates that this was a controlling and coercive relationship from the start. So I put coercive control is at the heart of domestic abuse, and that's something that we're probably hearing a lot more now. We are starting to become more familiar with coercive control, and we are starting to say, you know, it is at the heart of domestic abuse. And with that, we need to then understand it's also at the heart of domestic homicide. So when we, before I go forward, a lot of the research we did was on femicides and domestic homicides in the relation of a heterosexual relationship, so a male perpetrator and a female victim. So for some of the examples I will be giving, they all will be male to female violence. So the killing of the woman is the final act of control and not a loss of control. And I think this is really, really important because unfortunately we have a media that kind of sensationalizes these killings with language such as frenzied attack, devoted husband loses anger in violent rage, and the language really indicates this loss of control. And actually, when we look at domestic homicide cases and when we understand the wider picture, it is the final act of control. It is complete control, because it is a removal of that person's life. It is a removal of the victim's life. It is to say, you don't get to be happy, you don't get to move on, you don't get to separate. I will take your life from you. And when we looked at individual cases, a lot of this was premeditated, it was thought about, and there is decision making within that. And I don't think that is often very clear, and that is unfortunate, because a lot of the media sometimes in the tabloids do imply that it's frenzied or that it's crazy and that the perpetrator's just lost it, and this is just not true. The control extends beyond the victim. The control goes to the family, the friends, it can lead to professionals. And I just think it's really, really important as professionals that we remember that we're not immune to perpetrators' manipulation. So I've been doing this work for quite a long time, and I would hold my hands up and say that you know, I can't say that a perpetrator would not be able to manipulate me, even with all the knowledge and the understanding that I have. And that's because none of us are immune to it. Perpetrators are very, very calculating, very, very clever. And on numerous occasions, they will go on to also coerce and manipulate professionals as well as the victim themselves. And as as the last point, I've kind of put, small acts can often lead to the most sinister acts of violence. So again, when we sometimes come across instances of domestic abuse and we're trying to build up that picture, it might just sound like small acts. So it might sound like, oh, he hides my keys, he puts me down and he calls me stupid. And on those initial thoughts, we might not be thinking that this could be something dangerous, and we might not even think that this can lead to something such as homicide. But actually, in almost majority of the homicide cases that we looked at, that was evident throughout, that these small acts were dangerous and they did lead to the homicide. So I've just put some data from the Femicide Census 10-year report. So the Femicide Census from 2009 to 2018. And as we can see, on an average, and this is something that I'm sure everyone is quite familiar with because it's a statistic that's shared a lot, that a woman is killed by a current or former partner every 4 days. So from 2009 to 2018, 888 women were killed by a former or ex-partner. And of these women, over 40% were known to have separated or attempted to separate. And I think this is really important. I think it very much links with the previous presentation about that extension of control and how that does not end when the victim is trying to get away from the relationship. As we can see, of these cases, nearly 90% of the women were killed within the first year of separation. And I think that is extremely telling, because what we're seeing here is that extension of control, that even if the victim is left and it could be considered the moment of safety, it's really not, because that post-separation abuse continues, and that can also lead to homicide. We tend to hear, you know, the most risky and violent time for the victim is when she leaves the relationship. And I think just looking at that data, it really evidences, 90% were killed within the first year. Okay, so I'm just going to share some what is called the homicide timeline. So this was developed by Professor Jane Monckton-Smith, and some of you might be familiar with her work. So she did a number of studies looking at this kind of 8-stage pattern that leads to domestic homicide. And one of the key things that she said is that with these homicides, they are the most predictable and the most preventable. So I'm just going to go through a bit of her 8 stages, and I would recommend anyone to go and have a look at that. There's a short YouTube video and she goes through and talks through the 8 stages, and it is really, really interesting. So the first stage is a pre-relationship history of stalking or abuse by the perpetrator. When you look at DHR's domestic homicide reviews or many domestic homicide cases, you will see that often, sometimes the perpetrator has a history of abuse. He has stalked previous girlfriends. He has had previous partners call the police about him. Often, not always, there is a history of abuse. So second stage is the romance starts developing quickly into a serious relationship. And you might have heard of some of the terms they use, like love bombing. So it's, you know, relationship starts really great, it's really happy, he seems amazing, and it escalates very quickly into a serious relationship. But we know with coercive control that it is the ways that he is extending that control from the start. So finding ways to have her trust, finding ways to suggest what he might think is best for her. And stage 3 is then that the relationship is then dominated by that coercive control. And again, I think it's really important that we don't just think of this in the context of a violent, angry man that is saying you can't go here and you can't do that. But actually, a lot of the time it comes across very endearing and very caring. And it's more around, you know, well, I'm not sure if you should do that because well, you don't want people thinking that of you, or I'm just really concerned about your health. I'm really concerned about your well-being. A lot of the control is manipulated to seem that it comes from a caring place. So it's definitely not easy to spot, and it's definitely not easy to recognise. And that leads us to stage 4, which is a trigger to threaten the perpetrator's control. So this is the example of where the victim might feel like, I want to leave or I want to separate. And that threatens the perpetrator, because then he is about to lose that control. He's about to lose that control of that person. And so he might say things like, I won't be able to live without you. If you leave me, like, I'll kill myself. And I think when we're working with victims and survivors, we have to remember this. And I'll come to it a bit later about how we kind of find creative ways to talk with victims and survivors about some of these indicators that are there. So stage 5 is escalation, and that's when we see the intensity and frequency of those controlling tactics increase. So it could be an increase in stalking or an increase in threats that the perpetrator is going to kill themselves, but we see there's an escalation taking place. And then stage 6, the perpetrator has a change in thinking. So either the perpetrator chooses to move on, and most likely if they do move on, they will continue that perpetration onto someone else. When we was doing the research, there were cases, and quite a number of them, I think almost 30 of the perpetrators had killed before. Around 20 of them had killed partners previous to the partner that they'd murdered. So serial perpetrators that had murdered more than one woman. And then there is the planning. So the perpetrator might buy weapons, or they might seek opportunities to get the victim alone. And again, you know, I don't think this is something that I definitely wasn't aware of until I started doing the research, is how many perpetrators are premeditating that murder. So there were cases where they were Googling how to hide a body, you know, Googling certain things to buy online, hiding their history, their search history, parking their car in a certain location so that it wouldn't be linked to the CCTV, thinking and actually planning and deciding on how they were going to kill their wife or ex-girlfriend or their partner at the time. And then there is the final act, which is the homicide. So the perpetrator kills his or her partner, and then possibly also hurts other victims within that. And this, again, is something that we saw on a number of occasions. Unfortunately, as we can imagine, there are often children in these incidents, and children that try to save mum, or even perpetrators that also kill the children in order to have that complete control that nobody gets to live on or enjoy a life without him. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some cases. All the cases that I'm talking about here are in publicly available information. So, you know, you can go away and have a look at these in more detail. So the first one is one you might be familiar with. So it's the murder of Claire and Charlotte Hart. This was in 2016. They were murdered by Claire's husband, Charlotte's father, Lance Hart. Now, both were killed 4 days after Claire had decided to leave her husband. There had been no history of physical violence. I don't think, from what I read, that they were known to services or anything like that. But Luke and Reinhardt, who are Charlotte's brothers, and Claire and Lance's sons, they went on to talk about this because that they obviously have survived this, and they now raise awareness on coercive control. And I've just put in a quote that Luke said, because I think it's really interesting. He said, "We never thought he was dangerous. We thought he was just horrible, a nasty person, but we never thought he was dangerous. But that's because we didn't understand that control is at the root of domestic abuse." And I think that's really interesting, because again, it's that when they talk about growing up, they said, you know, our dad was mean to us, he was cruel to us, he was very controlling, he would choose what we would watch on the TV, he was horrible to our mom, and, you know, to summarize, he was just a nightmare to live with. But we didn't think he was dangerous, and we didn't think that he would be capable of killing our mother and our sister. And again, it's that understanding that coercive control, and just seeing those small acts as actually just as dangerous as the violence that we might see in physically violent relationships, or perpetrators that demonstrate their control through physical violence. And the second case that I've put in here is of a suicide case, actually. So Stephen Gain, 31, he abused and controlled his partner Kelly Sutton, 31, and to the point where she ended her own life to escape the abuse. Now, this was a landmark case because it was the first time that anyone had been convicted of coercive control after the death of the victim. So Kelly Sutton took her own life. And it was found then, when it went through court, that there was a history of abuse in that relationship. Now, the relationship was only 5 months, but Kelly's family and friends spoke and said, you know, in those 5 months, she went from really happy, really bubbly, to completely isolated, to anxious and quiet. But even through this, the family were unaware that Kelly was being physically and emotionally abused and controlled by her partner Stephen. So he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and like I said at the time, this was really significant, because suicide again is an element that we're still, I think, learning about, and we still haven't quite grasped the data on in terms of suicides. But the court heard how Gain would check her underwear to check that she was not cheating on him, how he kept her bank card, how he would text her numerously, and all these different forms of control over that 5-month period. And prior to the court case, Kelly's family said that they were unaware of the abuse. They didn't know what she was experiencing, and they didn't know that Stephen was perpetrating that abuse against her. Okay, so just to summarise, and like I said, there's a lot that can be said about this, and there's a lot of cases where I think if you look at domestic homicide, you are going to see coercive control. But we need to start seeing domestic abuse as more than just an argument. We need to understand that it's extremely dangerous, and the impact of coercive control can be fatal. And I think sometimes, you know, we might view coercive control and those non-physical elements of coercive control as not as high risk or not as much of a risk, but actually very much is. And so we need to go beyond the risk assessments. And I think the risk assessments are important, and they are useful as a guideline, but I don't think that we can solely rely on risk assessments, because the truth is, when it comes to domestic abuse, you can't really measure risk. You can never look at a case and say, this isn't going to end in homicide. So I think we have to find more creative ways to engage with victims and survivors to find out what's happening in the home. A victim might not say he threatens to kill himself, but we need to be asking questions about that. So when you've thought or talked about leaving, you know, what does he say? Does he say to you that he can't live without you? What, you know, we need to find more creative ways when talking with victims and survivors. And an example there that I've put is, again, a publicly available case that we might be familiar with is Molly McLaren. She was 23, and in 2017 she was murdered by her ex-boyfriend of 7 months, and there was no history of physical violence in that case, and she was, you know, sadly killed in the middle of the day in broad daylight by her ex-boyfriend. And I think if Molly had accessed the service, or possibly, I mean, she did go to the police, but I don't think if a dash was conducted, she would have necessarily scored above a 14 and been deemed as like a MARAC or a high risk case. And I think, again, you know, that's us thinking beyond just what we see on a scoring sheet or on a risk assessment, and actually asking questions that might indicate, well, he's become more possessive, he's stalking her more, and taking note of that behaviour and using our professional judgment of what we know. And that we need to be self-aware as professionals. So I mentioned this at the start, you know, we're not immune to being manipulated or coerced by the perpetrator, and being aware of that, and also being aware with other staff, because this is something that we might be witnessing ourselves with other members of staff, and just to be mindful of that, so that, you know, we don't fall under the assumption that because we have this knowledge that we also are immune to it. And I think there needs to be more work done, and there needs to be more of a link between suicidal behaviour and suicidal feelings and domestic abuse. And like I said, I do think this is something that is being spoken about a lot more now. And obviously there's the example of Stephen Gain and Kelly, in the aspects that, you know, he was convicted of coercive control, and there was a clear evidence there that he caused and contributed to her suicide. And I think there's a lot more cases like that that we just don't know about, or that they haven't been classed as domestic abuse. And interestingly, I put the case of Derek Potter again. You know, if you have a chance, go off and read about it. It's quite interesting. He murdered his wife, I think it's in 2017, and he pretended that she had committed suicide. So she was found hanging, and when the police investigation came, they pretty much took it at face value that she had ended her life. There was, of course, like a lot of backlash to when this was to the police when this all came out, but up until a week before her funeral, everyone was under the assumption that she had committed suicide, and Derek continued to live his normal life as and portray himself as a grieving man who'd lost his wife. A week before the funeral, he confessed to a co-worker that he had strangled his wife and made out that she had committed suicide. Now, if he had never confessed that, he most likely would have got away with that, and we would have all been under the assumption that this woman had committed suicide and that this man was grieving the loss of his wife. And I think that's really interesting as well, in terms of, you know, that belief that was just given, that and possibly because maybe he didn't come across like the perpetrator behavior that they were expecting. He was just a calm, you know, cooperative man. And finally, coming back to it again, that we need to remember that domestic homicide is the final act of control. I just think it's so important to remember that. And there were so many cases that we looked at that evidence this. And again, going back to that language around the kind of frenzied attack, you know, this notion that he just picked up the knife and he just lost it. In almost 50% of the cases that we looked at, there was an example of overkilling, which is excessive force used to kill the victim. And when we had the opportunity to actually even attend court cases to hear about those cases in detail, there were some cases that the woman was stabbed. I think the worst one was 175 times. But when we were able to hear more detail within the courts, actually for some of those cases, those the precision of the knife was very specific. So the forensics and everybody said, well, actually, this would take a lot of care and a lot of time to cause these wounds. It's not just that angry, frenzied attack that it's portrayed to be. So we just have to remember that domestic homicide is a decision, and it is having that control and using that control and ending the life to say, you don't get to have a life without me. But it's not the loss of that perpetrator losing control in a rage. So yes, that's my presentation. Sorry, I know not the cheeriest subject in the middle of the day, but yeah, happy to hear any questions later on that.
Thank you, Keisha. That's really interesting. And I think I think it probably doesn't possibly feel like it's the sort of where people don't probably come across a lot of domestic homicides in day-to-day practice, but I think it's probably really important in being able to differentiate as a social worker the difference between those cases that have that potential and understanding how cases end up in that place. Because I think one of the real problems for social workers is actually I think domestic violence is identified in about 50% of all children and families assessments, is actually of all those incidents, how do you differentiate between one incident of domestic violence and another incident of domestic violence and make those decisions? So I think it's helpful in that context to start to think about what are the features of those cases that are the most serious, because I think often we've relied upon the dash, and I think there's been some discussion in the chat about the dash, and perhaps we might come back to the dash. And it's something that Liz Kelly said in the last webinar, which was actually that most women who die, who are killed, actually they're logged as sort of standard or medium on the dash. So I think some of the tools that we're traditionally using in order to assess risk are not actually particularly predictable, good at predicting that risk, and we need to have a much broader understanding of domestic violence in order to really understand each particular case. So I think that's really helpful. There have been some requests for your slides, Keisha, and I think somebody's asked for your email. I'm not going to. I shall. If you want to give your email, then I will let you give it. It's up to Keisha whether she gives her email. If not, I can have some discussions afterwards with people about how we make the slides available. We've not normally made the slides available because the whole presentation goes onto YouTube, so you can see the slides again there, but there are some possibilities, so I will have some discussions after. And I think for people who have been asking Emma in the chat, just to chat, I suspect it's probably a bit hard for Emma to take note, to pick out people's addresses from the chat. I don't know whether you want to comment on that, Emma, but I think probably people will need to email Emma and ask her, and then she can reply to your email rather than just
yes, please, yes,
in the chat. So
yes, exactly. And I've already sent about 50 people the slides in the last 20 minutes. I've just been pinging them off like mad.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you very much. So yes, so anyone who has asked for Emma's presentation in the chat, can you email her direct rather than, you won't get it just from leaving it in the chat. So yeah, so thank you very much. So our last presentation, which again I think will intersect really nicely with coming on from what Keisha has said, is from Deb. So thank you very much, Deb, for coming, and I will hand over to you to give your presentation.
Oh, thanks, Susie. Thank you for inviting me today. It's really good to be here. So I just want to say that the work I do is not limited to crisis management, but it involves establishing a really, really quick relationship with victims, and it's based on trust, respect and transparency. I offer advice and safety planning with clients and professionals that are working with the family, and we'll also advocate on behalf of them to ensure that their voice is heard. We are an invisible service, but we respond to clients quite quickly within a 48-hour period normally. Our role is integrative to the multi-agency partnership working in order to incorporate a specialism into the process of any decision making around risk management plans and keeping the victim and family safety central to that process. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a young woman today, but before I do, I just want to say that fear and confusion are central to our understanding of coercion and control. It is like living in a world of moving goalposts, shifting sand, like constantly walking on eggshells, a world of everyday terror, and one in which the abuser places invisible shackles on the victim. So I'd like to introduce you to someone who's given me full permission to talk about her exclusively, her story, her journey, and her message to all of you listening today. We agreed that it would be best to use different names in order to protect her family, and I will be her voice. Hi guys, my name is Dee, and I was 16, nearly 17 when I met Em. He was 19. I would say that I was a confident, friendly, young, bubbly and outgoing person who was just about to start an apprenticeship in hairdressing. I needed a job to tie me over, so I got a part-time job at the same place that Em worked. I wasn't attracted to Em at all, but he was popular and made me laugh. The first time we spoke on our own, he told me that I was going to have his kids. I actually laughed it off at the time because I thought he was just cracking another joke. Little did I know how true this was going to be. After a few months of him chasing me, I did give in and agreed to date him. During the honeymoon phase of our relationship, we spent a lot of time together with friends at first, but as time went on, my friends just dropped one by one. Em had also got a car, so I was happy to be driven around, taken to clubs, out for dinner at Em's expense. He was generous, kind, and even though I was underage for drinking and stuff, he'd take me with him and treat me like an adult. Parents weren't happy though and threatened to kick me out as I was spending so much time away and treated the house like a hotel. I think they were right. But I'd tell Em about this and he'd say things like, don't listen to him. You're old enough to make your own decisions now. I spent all of my time with Em. We'd always be in the car driving out to places, or I'd borrow a friend's house. Sounds crazy, but Em didn't know. He didn't want us to go to his house where he lives. He didn't get on with his family and he didn't want to meet mine. I started getting introduced to Em's friends and struck up at some relationships with their girlfriends. It was quite odd at first because we used to be stuck in a room while the boys went out, sometimes for hours at a time. I made the mistake of asking Em when he got back from where he'd been and said to him, where have you been? You know, you've been ages. Shut the fuck up, woman, he said. Don't you fucking trust me or what? No one else is here asking this shit, are they? He'd say it was a man thing and I should stop embarrassing him in front of his mates. So I stopped embarrassing him. I felt mortified when he did this. So I ain't going to put myself in a situation like that again, am I? We started arguing about silly things at first. Em would always win though, and I'd always end up crying. I was just getting more and more tired. I'd go to work, get picked up straight after a shower, go to his friends, spend the night chatting with the girls. Then he'd drop me off in the early hours so I could get a few hours sleep. Sometimes when I needed to see him on my own, I'd beg him to have a night in. He'd ask a friend for the keys to their place and we'd have a few hours on our own. I was okay with this as we didn't have our own place, so we just did what we did. There were times I didn't want to see him. If I ever tried to suggest some time apart, I'd be accused of seeing another guy or putting other people before him. Mum and Dad said they noticed a big change in the way I dressed and how much time I was away. I never bothered with makeup anymore. My friends stopped coming over and I always apparently got defensive whenever they tried to mention Em's name or asked to meet him. I think looking back now, I was so scared that he'd embarrass me or kick off in front of them that it just wasn't worth it. But it wasn't normal really, was it? I didn't know because it was my first serious relationship. When I got pregnant, I thought things had changed for the better. I spent time talking to him about the baby. We'd talk for hours about what we'd buy, where we'd live, who we'd tell. He didn't want me telling my family yet because he hadn't told his, so I kept things quiet. One night while I was at his mate's girlfriend's house, I saw her get beat up for leaving a tea bag in a cup. She'd made one of his friends the tea. That was the first time I'd seen anything so violent. I mean, he was proper punching her down and kicking her. She didn't say a word. I tried to intervene, but Em told me to leave, and he made me do this while the beats was going on. How can we do that? She's getting hurt. We need to do something. Shut the fuck up and stay out of other people's business, or you'll get some of that too. I don't think I've ever been so shocked. The next day, he acted like nothing had happened. I told him, I've got to tell Mum I'm pregnant. Look, we'll tell him at the weekend, but not before. That night, I'd gone to a friend's house with them. I saw the girl that had been beaten. She got black eyes and split lip. Nobody said a word. She just served tea again. We left early that night. On the way home, Em had been different with me, odd like. He asked me why I'd been looking at his friend the way I did, you know. It was disrespectful. Of course, I denied everything. Tried to make him see sense, but he was having none of it. He drove like a madman through the streets, and we ended up in some woods somewhere. He screamed at me to get out of the car, so I did. I was terrified of what he was going to do to me. He picked up a large stick and came at me with it, telling me I was going to get what was coming to me, and from the start he'd been too soft. He raised his arm before I shouted, "No, the baby, I'm pregnant." He stopped, dead in his tracks, and switched to being deadly silent. I don't know whether I preferred him kicking off. At least I knew what was coming next, but we drove home in silence and I didn't know what he was going to do. When we got back to the place we were staying, I was sobbing and he told me to shut it and I should count myself lucky. I was so scared, so shocked. I had a moment of complete madness, and I'm ashamed to say that I took all the tablets that I found in this cupboard. Em started shouting through the door, telling me to open it or he's going to break it down. He managed to get me to unlock it by being quite calm and quite nice. And when he found out what he'd done, he raced me to hospital and told the nurses that I'd taken tablets because I was worried about telling my parents that I was pregnant. I said nothing. I just told the staff I wanted to die. Em used my phone and called my mum and dad, and they turned up. He told them that he loved me and he was going to sort everything out. And now the pressure had been taken off me because they now knew I was pregnant, we could move forward. As you can imagine, my parents weren't best happy about the news, but they promised me they'd support me. I was 3 months pregnant. Em took me away for a holiday because he was really sorry for hurting me. I said no to any support or help. Em didn't trust people and said we could sort it out ourselves. I believed him. When we got back, Em told me he'd got a plan. I got to go to housing, tell him I'm homeless, and they'd be able to give me a house that we could both then live in. I ended up arguing with him and said, we're together, so why shouldn't we go together? He kicked off. He says, I'm stressed out. I can't possibly live in a hostel with you. It'd drive me mad. Anyway, I'd end up punching somebody who said the wrong thing, and that'll only be for a few weeks anyway. I was in that hostel alone most nights, and I had to be in for the curfews early evening. He'd drop me off and leave. People were talking. Rumour had it that he was seeing other girls. I was embarrassed. I felt proper low about it and humiliated, but Em only got mad at me every time I mentioned it. You don't trust me? Eventually, I wasn't allowed to see anyone or go anywhere because these people were really trying to split us up. I actually later found out that he had been seeing another girl and he'd met her at a party they were both at. I'd gone from being totally outgoing, bubbly and energetic to being frightened of his temper, low, withdrawn, exhausted all the time, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly, and I was heavily pregnant. The only thing that kept me going was the baby. I started buying little things with what little I had left to my benefits. I never saw a penny from what he borrowed, and when I complained, he threatened to bust my nose. He told me to do one because if I wasn't happy, leave. He'd say, see what happened to Laura? That's what'll happen to you. I'll do that time if you push me. I knew that Em's cousin was in prison for murder. He'd split his girlfriend's throat, and her baby was in the same room at the time. On the whole, there were some good days, but I did make excuses for him all the time and just hoped he would change once the baby was here. I made myself a pact that I'd try harder, made sure I didn't stress him and cause him to kick off. I gave birth about a month early. I'd begged him to be with me, but he kept telling me, no, get your mum to come and see you. Let her support you and call me when it's done. I did exactly this, and he turned up at the hospital with all of his friends. I was so embarrassed and ashamed. After Mum left, Em made me leave the bed while I was heavily bleeding, in pain, and go and take the baby to see them all in the waiting room so they could say hello. He acted so proud, and I thought it was still nice to see him looking at his son in this way. So I forgave him for not being with me at the time and showing up with this crowd. When I left the hospital just days after giving birth, Em had got some errands to run and had me wait in the car with each shop we went to. I'd gotten used to not challenging him and didn't want to upset him, so I stayed where I was until he took me home. It took him 3 hours to get me home and it was only a 20-minute drive. Em stayed for about an hour when we got home and then left. I didn't see him for a couple of days. And when he returned, he said he was sorry and gave me a story of somebody in his family dying. I believed him. I felt sorry for him, but I actually found out later that nobody had died and I actually had been seeing somebody else. And it was the same somebody else he was seeing while we'd sat outside the car and waited him for. He was in there doing whatever he was doing with her. I moved into my new home and things picked up for a short while. Let's get married, Em shouted at me one day, but we'll do it in secret and don't tell anyone, yeah? I thought he'd gone mad, I was on something. Tried to reason with him before he started accusing me of not wanting to be with him. Right royally kicked off at me until I threw myself at him when he was hitting me. I just wrapped my arms around him and made him stop. I'll marry you. Promise you won't tell anyone, he replied. I won't, I promise. So we got married. He made a big deal of getting a new suit, borrowed money from my maternity grant for the celebration meal, which was pizza at home. He then took £100 from me and didn't return until the following day. I cried myself to sleep that night, my wedding night. For the next 3 years, there were rows and arguments over money, more assaults on me. I was woken up all the time in the early hours to make tea for friends that Emma dragged home. They'd party all night and I'd be expected to sleep in the kitchen until everyone had had enough tea. I learned to say hello without making any eye contact. I'd never question or challenge him in front of his mates, no matter how I felt. I behaved in the right way so he could be proud of his wife. He was always so complimentary when I got it right. Eventually, I met Em's mum. I was told that I should act like a proper daughter-in-law and serve his mum because she was the queen. I didn't like Em's mum, as she shouted at me too. Nothing was ever good enough. If I dared complain, Em would stay at his mum's for most of the week and he'd be vile towards me for a long time. And for me being disrespectful, I'd soon learned that his mum was as violent as controlling as Em was. When I got pregnant for the second time, 3 years after little Bobby was born, I was elated. I always wanted 3 children. I told Em when I thought he was in a good mood. Get it aborted. Who's this it? Fucking slag. I lost it for the first time and I threw everything that I got at him. He was so shocked after that when things calmed, he laughed at me, told me he was joking and told me, of course I can keep it, but I have to tell his mum and pretend that he didn't know to get her on board. So I lied to his mum and we went on to have a little girl. That day when I had her, he told me, you know, if I ever catch you with another man, I'd wait till you were asleep. I'd sew up the bed sheet around you and I'd beat you until the sheets bled. Then I'd undo the sheets and I'd throw salt on your wounds. I mean, I'd just had a baby. I don't know what he was thinking. As the bills piled up and Em lost his job, things became really stressful. I never had enough money to feed the kids, so I'd ask Mum to help out, and these gifts were my lifeline. Em gave me just a pittance of my own benefits to get shopping. I wasn't allowed to treat myself. When Mum bought me a car after paying for me to pass my driving test, Em would take it and bring it back when the tank was empty. Eventually, I couldn't afford it, not the tax or the insurance, so I gave it him to sell. He told me he'd give me the money for the bills, so I got on mounting up. I never saw a penny. Mostly it was calm when he disappeared though, but sadly he always came back. I'd try and keep the kids quiet in case they woke him, and always felt like I was walking on eggshells. I'd ask for permission to run to the shop, even when he wasn't home, just in case he came back early to check on me, because it just wasn't worth the hassle. When we'd had our third child, Em pretty much didn't bat an eyelid, and after showing the baby off, he was always there for the, you know, just the appointments really. So when the health visitor turned up, he pretended to be the good father. He'd even flirt with her in front of me. She thought he was great. She thought he was charming, but he charmed the pants off any female that would listen, actually. She didn't pick up that I never really spoke. And if I did, it was because I had prompts to speak from him. We had plenty of practice. I knew exactly what to do to get this right, and I wasn't going to try and get it wrong, was I? Em chose the nurseries and schools that Bobby, Sarah and Adam went to. And even if it meant I had to get 2 buses to drop them off and pick them up, he didn't care. I felt guilty all the time because they never really had a full-time dad that spent time alone with them. He'd borrow money on their birthdays and make it look like he lavished them with gifts. He used to make me take photos of him, opening the presents so he could look back and say, I did this for you guys, you never went without, you know. These photos don't ever mention that I ended up paying the debts back to whoever he borrowed the money from. I'd have to tell them who gave what and give him any birthday money they got from the family. I never kept a penny. He never once changed a nappy, never once got up in the night or fed them a bottle. He never prepared a meal for them or played football with them. He never went to a parents' evening or dropped and picked them up from school. He never put a plaster on them if they fell or kissed them better. But he did love them in his own way. The kids always looked forward to seeing him. Every now and again he would drop his guard and play hard with them, making them laugh. They dreamt of all the promises he made, and when he let them down, and he did, I had to pick up pieces. I had the tears and the tantrums. I tried my best to fix what was missing. I was just so tired of being let down, being on my own most of the time, and having to always make up lies to cover up for his absences or create another excuse, so I was stressed out when he was home. Everyone else thought I had the perfect partner, but behind closed doors, I had the worst of him. I knew I had to leave. He'd never hit me in front of him, but he never had to. I was so terrified of his temper that I just complied with everything he said. I never realised what they might be hearing things or how they really felt about their dad when he did shout at them. I realised that I actually never laughed anymore. In fact, probably cried myself to sleep every night for years while I was alone. I actually started to wish he would leave me and find somebody else. I prayed he would just walk away and leave me alone. No dramas, he'd just go. The last straw came one night when he sent my sister home early because he'd returned home to look after the children. He'd faked a robbery to claim on our insurance, and the house was in a right state, broken windows. He told me what the plan was. I had to call the police and tell the story of what happened while I was at work. But somebody broke into the house and took everything that was of any value. I didn't have anything really, but he gave me a list of the valuables that I owned that had been taken. I didn't want to lie, but what was the alternative? He left me to deal with the police, CID officers and insurance men. When the payment for a couple of grand came through, he spent a lot on himself. I didn't see a penny. I still had the bills to pay, the debts were in my name, they were mounting up, I had a visit from the bailiff, so I was so frightened of the door knocking that I ignored it most days, and only ever went out to drop children off at school. Em told me I was a shit mum, that I was a loser, I'd never find anybody else. I started to stay away from the house a bit more and he noticed. So guess what, he started to be at home more. My behaviour must have changed though. I rebelled a bit and resisted his demands when I felt brave enough to do so, but I always got the consequences. What was the worst that could happen? To be honest, I was past caring about whether he would beat me or not. I was still scared, but I was still starting to imagine life without him. It was getting harder to act it all out. Em started to stay at home a bit more, and that's where I was, who I was with, why I was dressed up like that. It became much more hostile. I got the threats, but I just ignored him, and sometimes he'd go away for days. I still never had any makeup on. I looked like I was always wearing some baggy jumper and jeans. I hardly looked the part, but trying to attract anyone else. That was the last thing on my mind anyway. I tried to leave him. I told him we needed a break. So in the middle of one night, I heard a window smash. I called 999 and told them somebody was trying to break in. I grabbed a cupboard and placed it across my door. The children were in the same room because they slept in the bed. When I heard footsteps coming up the stairs, I was still holding my breath, but then I could hear police sirens and cars approaching my street. I heard him shouting, "You fucking bitch, you're dead if you fucking tell him anything." He left. When the police turned up and I told them that I thought it was a burglar, and they checked the area and boarded up the window, I was told to get some sleep. I never slept a wink that night. To cut this very long story short, I suffered more than I can imagine for another 2 years. I was threatened, abused, followed everywhere, harassed to the point I couldn't take anymore. He damaged my property, messed me around with the kids, not turning to pick them up from school when he'd arranged to, or for contact with them. I had to pick up the pieces though. My family and his took the kids when I went back to work because I couldn't rely on him at all, but I would come home and he would be sitting in his car outside all night. One night when I came out of work, I went over to my car and found he wound all my windows down and poured water onto my driver's seat. I knew it was him because he'd been caught on CCTV doing it, but I didn't call the police. I couldn't get the kid's dad arrested. He left messages like this for me all the time, but I kind of ignored them and played it like I wasn't bothered. He threatened to take the children abroad, so I went to see a solicitor. I was told I needed to make a statement about his behaviour, so I dropped it. I decided to do all I could do to keep his mum and family happy so that they were on my side. I didn't hate him, but I had to force myself to take shitty comments and letdowns, to listen to the excuses. I nodded quietly and made sure I got passports with me and they were always with me. I had near to the ground and at least I'd be one step ahead of him. I thought if I did this long enough, he'd just stop. I was in a constant state of anxiety and dread. Sometimes, when he had the kids, he'd turn up at my work and leave them at reception for me, knowing that I would still have hours to go. Now, my boss was understanding, but you can imagine it was getting a bit much for them. I took a call at work one day and it was from one of his family members. He told me to leave work early and to watch my back as Emma had been overheard talking to his friend about taking me out. He's got a contract on your head. I left work, handed my notice in and went home. The kids were at his mum's, but I was distraught. He later showed up and after another row, he held a knife to my throat and told me that he was going to watch me die. I told him to do it anyway. Do it. He walked away and that was the last time he ever threatened me. I called my mum and I told her I was sick and asked her to have the kids. She agreed, so I stayed in bed for weeks until one day my sister came over. And this part of my journey is really painful. After years of relentless name calling and insults, I actually sat and told Sam that my kids were better off without me and that I didn't want to live anymore. The life had drained away from me. Sam could see I was in a bad way and we got the doctor out. The rest of my journey to get to the point that I have today included a breakdown, more self-harm, suicidal thoughts. I had long-lasting complex trauma issues, depression, anxiety, fear, guilt, shame, fatigue, illness and grief, you name it, I had it. This is why I wanted to share my story with you today. I didn't tell anyone about Em's behaviour because I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want to hurt my family. I didn't want to be exposed as a liar and somebody had failed. I was also scared. I genuinely thought that he would change, that all he needed was love, loyalty and support. At times I feared for my life, but when I didn't, I had escaped. I felt ashamed of myself and blamed myself for who I was. I met Deb. I remember I was a mess. I remember her asking me in one of our catch-ups, this was like quite a long time after she'd done all the safety planning with me and we're getting like back on my feet. She said, Dee, who are you? I was speechless. I couldn't give her an answer. I don't know who I am. But the gravity of hearing myself say this was life-changing. I knew I was mum, sister, daughter, ex-wife, friend. But I didn't know who I was. That was the day that I decided I was going to get to know me again. And I have found myself many years later, the children and myself have got the best relationship ever. We still suffer the impact sometimes, but not in ways that we can't deal with. I still get affected by my low self-esteem, my lack of confidence, my lack of motivation. I do get moments of depression and loss, but I recover quickly and I get on with it. My love for my children is what's kept me alive. Without them, I know for a fact I would not have made it through. No one told me about coercive control. I never understood what was happening to me or what signs to look out for. It just happened. It was evil. It was powerful. Breaking the cycle is not just about one man's behaviour. It's many people's. It's generational. This type of behaviour kills people slowly. It's going to be passed down to even more generations, so we need to educate people about it. We need to stop and to break the cycle of many generations. I'm one of the lucky ones. The hardest and most painful part of this journey is past, and I've survived to tell my story. Others haven't. Thank you for listening to me today. This is who I am, and this is my voice. Thank you.
That's really powerful, Deb. Thank you very much for that, and thank you to you can pass on our thanks to the woman who actually wrote, whose experience that was. I think it's really helpful to hear the actual reality of it and actually how it plays out. I think that's really helpful to people, just to see how it actually, what it looks like in real time, really, in real people's lives, and helps people to probably identify what sort of things that people are looking for and what you might expect. I also think I mean, again, it's really interesting that I think what you've said today, I think will feed in really nicely to our next webinar, which is about mothers, domestic abuse and social work interventions, where in that we're going to look at actually how social workers engage with mothers who are often the focus of interventions around domestic abuse, even though they are also the victim as well. So yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. So we will get on to questions. So anyone who has any questions about coercive control, if you could add them into the question and answer box, please. There is quite a lot going on in the chat, so there's no problem with that, but it's really difficult to fish out questions when there's lots of chat and stuff going on. So yeah, that's great. I think there is a couple of questions really about the courts, and I think what's interesting, I know, Emma, you have answered Paul's question about parental alienation, but I think it's perhaps something that's worth having an initial sort of just response to, really, because I think that there are more cases that are being identified and labelled as parental alienation within the system and within social care. I think social care definitely CAFCAS, and I'm aware that there's a government review at the moment on contact, and I think that the government has got out a review for people to do some is looking at the issue of contact, and I think it's in that area sometimes that it comes up. So I don't know whether that is that something just, I don't know, Emma, that you want to respond to, because I think in terms of understanding it, I think it'd be helpful for people.
Absolutely. I'll put a couple of links into the chat as well, which will be useful resources. So I think that in the last couple of years, there has been a real upsurge in perpetrators telling the family courts that they are victims of parental alienation, and that the reason that the children don't want to see them or are terrified of them is because usually the mother has alienated the children from them. And that's really problematic, because research from the US by Joan Meyer has shown that courts usually believe the claim of alienation by the father a lot more than they believe the claim that the father was domestically abusive and violent from the mother, and then the father gets the contact that he was seeking, sometimes even that residency is changed to him. So the children are then living full time with the perpetrator. It is really problematic. And this is about mapping perpetrators' patterns so that we recognize not who's making what accusations, but who has been consistently showing that they are acting in the best interests of the children. You know, which parent has been doing that? Which parent has been, you know, trying to keep the children safe, caring about how the children feel, trying to do the best for them? Which parent is providing their day-to-day care and looking after them? Often we find with perpetrators, they will make a big show of how much they love and adore the children. But if you ask them some basic facts like, when is your child's birthday? What are some of your child's favorite foods? Who is your child friends with? What colors do they like? They can't answer those questions because as parents, they're extremely self-centered and they don't really know their child very well. They just want to possess them. So yeah, I think the Safe and Together Institute has a tool for mapping perpetrators' patterns, which I've heard good things about, and that could be really useful in these circumstances. And I know that, as you mentioned, there was a government review that was led by the academic Rosemary Hunter, and it's called the Harm Report. I will put a link to that in the chat. And I know also that there is a presentation which I've got somewhere on my computer, and I'm just searching for the name of it now so you can look it up as well, for people who are watching on the webinar. So let's see if I can very briefly find it. Yeah, okay, so I would suggest having a look at a research and practice report that was co-authored by Katz and Safe Lives and is really good. It's called Coercive Control: Impacts on Children and Young People in the Family Environment, authored by Danielle McLeod. So if you type that into Google, Coercive Control: Impacts on Children and Young People in the Family Environment, you can have a look at that. And that has some good stuff on contact as well, and spotting perpetrators and these things that have been brought up today.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Yes, that's great. Thank you. I don't know, Keisha, did you want to say anything about parental alienation?
We're just listening. I mean, I think it's interesting because I don't even think it's so much, as we probably know, an issue with the court. I think we are seeing a lot of the kind of parent alienation cases, but I think it's actually really reflective of still our society as a whole. And when we talk about the fact that, you know, we struggle to believe maybe that mom's the one that's safeguarding, and we struggle to believe that dad's actually the perpetrator, we would much rather believe that maybe he is like really keen to look after his children, feeling alienated. I think it feeds into a wider issue of kind of like our victim blaming society and our kind of culture in which we tend to not always believe women, and women have to really jump a lot of hoops to kind of get across that they are protecting or defending or supporting their children. And I think we see that throughout the entire system. We know that it is often the mum that has to do a lot to evidence that she is keeping her children safe. So whilst I do feel like, yeah, that 100% is something that needs to be improved and more work to be done around, I think it also feeds in to a kind of wider societal picture as well, that actually the courts is only a reflection of our kind of sometimes general attitude towards being distrustful of women and not so quick to believe them.
Absolutely.
And also I kind of I don't have the right word for it, kind of our sympathy sometimes with perpetrators, and I say that because that's what we did see in a lot of the domestic homicides, sometimes the language around the perpetrator, even when he'd killed brutally his wife or something, would be like, oh yeah, but he's had a really tough time. You know, only last year, sorry not to go on tangent, but last year we saw the sentencing of Anthony Williams when he killed his wife 5 days into lockdown, and he got 5 years. And the language was very like, you know, he's struggling, he was finding it difficult. And I think that plays a part too, the kind of sympathy language that we use around dads not being able to see their children. And we know that there are cases of that, but I think it just feeds into that wider issue, really.
And only less than 1% of court cases in the family court result in an order of no contact being made, less than 1%. So there's a lot of domestic abuse perpetrators that are in contact with their children, and very, very few get told, no, you can't have contact, which is really problematic, because a lot of them are still extremely dangerous and extremely harmful and very abusive and neglectful parents. I absolutely agree with what Keisha's saying, and I just want to say that I'm sure others agree that for the small percentage of real male victims of coercive control, and there are some, that obviously they need all the help and support, just like female victims as well. There are far fewer male victims of coercive control, specifically coercive control. I'm not talking about intimate partner violence. I'm talking about a partner who controls you, dominates you, micro-regulates you, just makes you feel tiny, threatens you, all of that. So there are fewer male victims of coercive control, but those who there are, they deserve all the help and support that women do, but there are far fewer of them. And as Keisha said, there is a real ongoing sort of sexism in a lot of our institutions, where women are often labelled as hysterical, as unreliable, as overly emotional, as manipulative, etc., which are stereotypes we've had for several thousand years and often still play out in our courts and our media.
That's helpful. Thank you, Emma and Keisha. Deb, did you want to add anything in relation to coercive control and the sort of parental alienation? I'm going to guess that you've come across this.
Yeah, quite a lot. So I mean, you know, it's been covered really quite appropriately, the answers that have already been given. It was just to sort of, I suppose, to say, you know, because I specialise in supporting young people now. And when they are going for contact, they're trying to promote that contact. So quite often, you know, we get this perception that, you know, they're young, they're going to say, hey, you know, my baby father ain't seeing their child, blah, blah, blah. But the majority of them, especially where there is coercive control, they want to, you know, promote healthy contact. And I think that just shouldn't be missed, you know, in people's understanding of, you know, this type of abuse.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So, because I think one of the difficulties is sometimes in talking about domestic violence, and I think these sessions, I mean, I think they are challenging actually, but I think we do have to hold on that domestic violence is predominantly a phenomenon that women are the victims and men are the perpetrators. And although there are male perpetrators of domestic violence, and I think, as you say, Emma, there are real male victims on all different types of ways of it playing itself out, they do exist. I think the pattern of abuse of violence between women, with women as the perpetrator, is actually quite different to the nature of their abuse is very different. And I think that's something that, I mean, I'm going to come back in this webinar series in next academic year to look to doing some stuff on domestic violence, another sort of series on domestic violence. And I think in that we will pick up some of those issues around men and the different patterns of violence in different types of relationships, because I think what we're talking about here is really a phenomenon that's in heterosexual relationships, and it's a dynamic that flows from men to women. But there are different types of domestic abuse, and those dynamics are different in same-sex relationships, and even different in male same-sex relationships, female same-sex relationships, and then where the domestic abuse is from the woman to the man. So I think hopefully for people who are listening, we can pick pick up some of those things a little bit, and perhaps next academic year, because these webinars will end at the end of June and then they'll start again in September. So just to pick that up really, because I think
they are often different, but I have occasionally heard of cases where there's been female to male coercive control, and it sounds exactly like it would if it was male to female. But those cases are really rare, and like you say, in the majority of cases, the dynamic is quite different. Yeah.
No, and I think it is important, I think, in terms of understanding domestic violence, that this is not an equal opportunities sort of pattern of behaviour, actually. And I think sometimes we're inclined to think as social workers, actually, we've got to think of it can happen anywhere. Well, it can happen anywhere, but it's significantly more likely to happen in particular places than others. And I think you have to hold on to that. Will you want to come in on anything? I think Elaine's do you want to say, Elaine?
I was actually coming in not so much on this question, but on the fact that I had said to somebody in the questions that we would pick up in this session, and I wanted to do it because I know Emma needs to leave as well. Yeah. The question was, what's the difference? How can you tell the difference between what appears to be coercive control and what appears to be a loving relationship? I think it was Olga who asked the question, and I may have summarised too much, but that was the question.
No, it's no problem.
And I just didn't, I thought it was probably related to this as well, because it can be quite difficult sometimes to tell between concern and concern that's focused on yourself rather than on somebody else.
Yeah. Did you want to come in and add? Sorry, I muted myself. Do you want to answer that, Emma? Obviously, because you've got to leave fairly soon, I think. Yeah.
Yes, in fact, a minute ago, but I'll answer it quickly. Yes, so I think it's the walking on eggshells factor. If the partner is nervous and worried and anxious and perhaps scared about how their other half will react if they do something, then that's where you've got coercive control. Because, like, you know, I could be really bossy and tell my husband to do something, sometimes I am, but he feels fully free to say, no, I'm busy at the moment, and he's not worried that I'm going to threaten him, hurt him in retaliation because he didn't do what I said. He has none of that fear. So it's this walking on eggshells. It's the modifying your behavior so you don't piss off your partner. It's your world getting smaller and smaller and smaller because you're desperately trying not to set them off. That's where you've got coercive control.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Emma. So I know you're going to be leaving us now. So just to reiterate to anyone, if anyone wants Emma's presentation, you need to email Emma on her email address, and it is in the chat, I think probably 6 or 7 times now, because I've posted it several times. So Emma's not going to pick it up from the chat if you've left your address there, so please do take away her email address and email her. Obviously she's now not going to be sending it to you straight away because she's got to go on to something else, but she will get back to you eventually. So thank you very much, Emma. We very much appreciate you coming to the webinar and sharing your research and work around coercive control, and people should definitely keep an eye out for your book, which will come out next year. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, probably about in the new year. If you take a look in the new year for coercive control in children's and mothers' lives, it'll either be out or about to be out. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the other speakers who were fantastic. And please do pass on all my support to the woman whose account you read out. It's amazing she's still alive and still functioning, and she's done amazing, and she sounds like a remarkable person. Thank you.
Will do, Emma.
Thank you, Emma. So yes, well, Deb, you're up on my screen. Is there anything you wanted to say in regards to the issue of identifying coercive control and picking it out from other forms of perhaps sort of intimate partner violence and sort of domestic abuse and things?
Yeah, I mean, it's all relationships start out in pretty similar ways. So you've got the honeymoon phase, and then healthy relationships might continue, and the caring side of things. But there is a really good, when thinking about abusive relationships and how they develop, it can be helpful to look at a piece of research that Albert Biderman did on, you know, how to control somebody. And it talks about different stages. So there's isolation, exhaustion, degradation, threats, and they're the 4 main areas. And he'd done that piece of work on a thought of how can so few control so many. So it was around a prisoner of war camp. And I think from that point of view, it does describe the journey quite clearly, and it does make a very clear cut. This is definitely coercion, control going on here.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Keisha, did you have anything you wanted to add around that point?
I mean, I think it's a great question, because I think we have to be really honest with the fact that sometimes we can't always tell whether you're working frontline, whether you have the type of specialist, whatever it is. I think there are always going to be cases that are hard to tell whether this is coercive control. And yes, we have the understanding of the patterns, and we do have the understanding of how you know, Emma explained it, with that feeling on edge. And I do think that does indicate that there is coercive control. But actually, I think we have to remember that a lot of us are coming from generations where the sex dynamics between, you know, heterosexual relationships of the man and the woman was very much that the man had control. That was normal, and it's been very normalized. So it wasn't ever really seen as a problem that a man would run a household or conduct the finances and all of those things. And a lot of us are stemming from those generations anyway. So there's a lot of things that are still quite normalized that have elements of that control, but are not under the language probably of coercive control, or how we're talking about it today. So I do think it is difficult. I think we have those clearer indicators like Emma discussed, which is, you know, that pattern of behaviour and that feeling scared by the decision. But I don't think that takes away the fact that actually within heterosexual relationships there are probably still a lot of unhealthy dynamics between how that power is shared within the relationship, and I think that's when it probably is a bit challenging, because I don't think it's always going to be clear cut. But for the aspects of coercive control, then yes, I would very much follow similar to what Emma says. But yeah, I just think, you know, we have to remember that we are coming, you know, moving on from generations of where control was completely normalized, and still is in some cases.
Yeah, I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because I think what we need in terms of social work and social workers' knowledge is about moving to an understanding that domestic violence, that it's more than just the physical assault. And I think quite often domestic violence is framed still very much around the physical assault, and physical assaults may be a feature of those relationships, but it may not be. And I think it's about looking, and when social workers are undertaking assessments, is looking for those patterns of behaviour and asking some of those questions I think that Emma raised, but I think also that Liz Kelly raised in the one before, around those sort of looking at who's controlling the money, can people go out, what sort of who's in control, and looking at the relationship and seeing that any incident of domestic violence perhaps in a wider context of the actual relationship and how it functions, rather than sort of going through a sort of process of just adding up how many incidents might have happened and whether the dash said the incident was high risk or low risk. It's moving beyond that sort of quite simplistic analysis using dash and the number of incidents, and looking at the pattern of behaviours that that dash and that incident exists within. So but it is tricky, I think, and I think actually I'm going to move on to, unless Elaine, did you want to say anything about that?
I just wanted to come in quickly just to say, yeah. I think that I'm just thinking of the story you were reading, Deb, or the person you were speaking for, because I was thinking about some of the questions in the chat where people have said, so should we see people separately? Should we, you know, and I was a probation officer many years ago when it was what CAFCAS is now as well. So I've done family separation reports where it was a family systems model and we always saw people in the same room. And, you know, it's quite difficult because even if we gave, I'm going to call you Deb for the story because it's easier, but even if we gave Deb the opportunity to talk to us, would she have felt able to, because of what might happen once she talked to us? And I don't think so. It may be that as professionals, whilst we can create those opportunities and we allow people to either tell us things, or we use all of the other things that we use to assess a situation, that actually we may always have to go with what feels like a feeling, because the person themselves can't actually tell us at the time. And I think that's, and we may need to take some of the responsibilities for that, that there is something about this that makes me feel deeply uncomfortable. And I will often talk in training and education about the worst story of violence and abuse that someone ever told me. And I felt completely cold towards this person while she was telling me. And she told me she'd been kidnapped, and she told me all these terrible things. Felt very cold towards her. And it was actually because she told it with such trauma. She was so traumatized. She had no emotion herself. She relayed this as a story that it didn't seem at all real, not in any part. I thought it was some sort of fantasy. And it was only when I spoke to the probation officer of the man who was still her partner, who told me it was so much worse than anything she'd even described to me. And I think so, sometimes that I was, in a way, I was very fortunate to meet her so early on in my career, because I understood a lot about myself then. But it's, sometimes these things are very hard for us to understand, because the abuse and the trauma is such that the person themselves has lost all of their ability to portray emotion and real fear and terror that the rest of us might feel at a tiny fraction of what they're experiencing. So I don't quite know what we do with that. I don't know how helpful it is of me to share that. But I think in trying to think about how do we as practitioners engage with these things, we do have to do some of that, reflecting on stories.
Yeah.
Can I just quickly come in there on that? Sorry, Susie.
For sure.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. And I think that's something that we really have to reiterate, is the fact that, we always say, we're all learning, but we really are. Like, some of these scenarios and some of the trauma and the cases that we're going to come across are incredibly difficult, that we are not prepped for, no matter how many books we've read or whatever. So there definitely needs to be that kind of support or framework, whether that's, you're able to talk to a manager or you're able to talk to colleagues. I've always found that colleagues were great for me in terms of kind of having that self-check-in. And there are, I think, moments where you have judgments and you have thoughts, and they're happening because naturally we all come with our own individual experiences and perceptions of things. And I think with social work and anything around such sensitive topics like this, we have to really always be mindful of that, and willing to kind of question some of those judgments or behaviours, and hopefully have that support system within the work that we do to be able to reflect and feed back, and have conversations around maybe difficult cases, because I think the perception or the idea that we're just going to know the answer sometimes, or we're always going to know what to say and always know what to do, is just like not true. Like, I would never say that. Even now, I just always know the answer and know what to do. So I think encouraging social workers or anyone in this space to continue to talk about things and have self-reflection, and not feel horrendous if you had a form of judgment or whatever, but you've taken yourself away and thought about that and where that comes from. That's all a part of the process in this, I think, in terms of learning.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I mean, there are quite a lot of questions from people about actually around sort of asking the question is why isn't there more training on it? And I think, I don't know what other people think, but I think when I qualified as a social worker in the 90s, is actually we got very little on domestic violence at all. And when I first started began practicing as a social worker, the only domestic violence that I dealt with was really severe stuff. It was the stabbings, it was where people had been left in a very, very life-threatening or died situation. And I think gradually there's been, and I think we've probably all experienced this, is real growth in our awareness of domestic violence. And I think coercive control is this sort of new phase of our understanding of domestic violence. And I do think we probably are getting some training, but I think the sort of what we know about domestic violence is moving very, very fast. And so I think getting training online around coercive control and the sort of the nuance around domestic violence, I think, is taking some time to sort of filter through. But I do think there's a lot of work, there's a lot of research going on out there, and there's a lot of organisations that do know an awful lot, like we're living without abuse. So I do think that is that I think that when people ask those questions about why aren't we getting more training, I think probably the fact that there are now councils with people like Keisha in them, and we've got Nikki Plummer at the next one, who is sort of essentially Keisha's equivalent in Birmingham Children's Trust. There are now people who are thinking about domestic violence and thinking about it in a strategic way across all sorts of services. So I think we are starting to think about it differently, and the domestic abuse bill, I think, will really change how councils work around domestic abuse. Deb, is there anything you want to come in and say around any of that?
No, I think you know, it's been pretty much, you know, what we've discussed so far is, you know, it's one of those, isn't it, where you just think, give me a week and I'll talk about whatever you like. It's about, you know, for me, it's about capturing the voice of what is really going on, you know, and that voice is so lost. And so, you know, with each situation, you know, like you said, you know, if reporting in isolation, you've got one issue that comes up, it doesn't capture things. You know, you've got to take time, you've got to be approachable, you've got to, you know, not look at this as a, you know, a start and a finish. You've kind of got to see it grow in front of you, and you've got, you know, you do witness things that are really unpleasant. I mean, Elaine, you know, talked about that, and some of the stories that you hear, and you just think, well, just imagine 100 times more, and then you'll probably get it about right, that this is what these survivors and victims are going through. And, you know, like I said, it's a generational thing. So to break a cycle, you know, that you know, it's a privilege really to talk to any victims of domestic abuse. You know, they are a lot stronger than they imagine, and they just don't have any idea of what they're going through. You know, and some of them don't recognise it as being abusive. Like Dee mentioned, you know, she'd got no idea what coercive control was. She knew what physical violence was, she knew what sexual violence was, she knew what financial abuse was, but she had no idea what this new term was being used around her. You know, and she was saying that, you know, just from her point of view, she wished she'd learned that a long time ago. So, I mean, you know, kids are learning more lessons in the corridor, aren't they, than in the classroom? You know, but there is no discussion about this. You know, if we don't understand it as professionals, you can imagine the children and those in families, the victims don't understand it. So it's about actually getting that across as well. But yeah, like I said, I mean, you have to bring me back into it, Susie, because I could talk about all sorts of things. I've probably even gone off the question that you asked, sorry.
No, that's fine. No, that's fine, don't worry. So we've got sorry, we've only got 3 minutes left. So I'm not going to ask any more questions, just because otherwise we'll end up going over. But what I do just want to say is thank you to everybody, to Keisha and to Deb and to Elaine for taking part in this webinar. Just to reiterate that there is the next webinar, the tickets are available on Eventbrite, and that's on mothers, domestic violence and social work interventions. So we're going to start to look at in that, as I've said before, about what social workers are, how they're working with mothers very particularly. And I will, there's been loads of interest in this series on domestic violence, so I will definitely set up another series of webinars in from September onwards, and I will pick up some of those issues, because people do raise it regularly around the sort of different patterns of domestic abuse in terms of men as victims and victims from the LGBT community, which I think there are some slightly different patterns and that people need to be aware of. It's not entirely the same phenomenon, and I think perhaps that speaks again to the nuanced knowledge that people need. And I think around domestic violence, when working with people, is we need to be able to understand actually what we're talking about. And I think there's lots of terms, I think, that and they don't apply to the same to everyone within it. So so hopefully I will pick that up next year. But again, yes, thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you to people for attending this session. It will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel within the next 1 to 3 days. And you can follow us at the moment on Twitter, which is WLV Social Work, and where I will post all the events that we've got going on. They will stop. There's another 4 after this in May, 2 in May, 2 in June. Then we will stop for July and August, and they'll start back up again in September. But you will see everything there, and I'm hoping to get a web page where you can see things in a more planned sort of way, rather than me just posting things on Twitter. But yeah, thank you very much for coming, and hopefully we'll see you again sometime. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Susie. Could we just thank everybody who's shared their own personal stories in the chat?
Yes, no, yes, absolutely. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Lovely to see you, Deb. And Keisha.